Another important thing that we have to learn about Active Directory is FSMO roles. So FSMO roles are basically five, and they are Schema Master, Domain Naming Master, Read Master, PDC Emulator, and then Infrastructure Master. So these are all the main roles that we have in Active Directory, and this is the way through which you actually learn what which one of our domain is a primary domain controller, which is our schema master, and each of them do a specific function. So when it comes to FSMO role, every forest actually must have schema and domain naming master, and then every domain in the forest should have read, PDC, and infrastructure master role. So they should have that. And if you don't have those in place, your Active Directory will no longer function. It will no longer work. Alright, so very first one is Schema Master, and then Schema Master is a domain controller that controls all of your updates and modifications to schema. And then once the schema update is completed, it actually replicates the schema to all other domain controllers in the directory. So any changes that you make, it replicates those changes to other schema masters, other schema in the domain, other domains, like if you have other schema masters too. And then to update the schema forest, uh, in a forest, you must be schema master. So if you want to update schema of a forest, you must be the schema master, which you can actually delegate access to someone through the Active Directory services. And there can only be one schema master in the entire forest. So you can only have one schema master. And in order to actually change or move a schema master role to another server, for example, if you have a primary domain controller that is a schema master and you want to change that schema master, you must be a member of a schema administrators group. And then by default, the first server is always the schema master. Another role that we have is called domain naming master. So domain naming master actually holds, or we can say that we can say that it holds the domain naming master role, and any addition or removal of our domains in the forest. So whenever you are trying to remove or add a domain in the forest, you're basically using domain naming master for that. And there can only be one domain naming master in the entire forest. So you cannot have two in one forest. And then for the first time, the first server always becomes the domain naming master. And finally, if you want to change or move something, move domain naming master to another server, you must be member of enterprise administrators group. So any removal or addition of domains that happens is going to happen through domain naming master. It checks, for example, when you install a new domain, it always checks to see if there is like an existing domain already in there. So all those happens from there. PDC emulator, primary domain controller emulator, it actually provides backward compatibility with Windows anti-backup domain controllers, and it actually advertises itself as a PDC for the domain. And then if you have a PDC emulator, what does it mean is that that server is the primary domain controller. And then it also acts as a domain master browser that maintains your passwords and users that you have in the domain. It also processes like password changes from client and then replicate it to other domain controllers that we have. And anytime there can only be one like primary domain controller in a forest. So if in a one forest you can only have one primary domain controller. And then by default the first server is the primary domain controller or PDC emulator. And if you want to change or move, you have to be domain administrator group. You have to be added to domain administrator group in order to actually make those changes. Infrastructure master is another one. So infrastructure master is responsible for updating actually references from objects within domains with objects in other domains. So when we have objects in one domain and we want to update them into another domain, that is where the infrastructure master role comes in. It compares its data with global catalog server, making sure that the data is always up to date. And then global catalog actually receives regular updates for objects in domain through replications, so that all the time the global catalog database is up to date. And then if the infrastructure master finds that is out of date, it requests updates from global catalog, and then infrastructure master replicates that updates data to other domain controllers that we have in the domain. Um, there can only be one infrastructure master role in every domain in the forest, same as the other which we discussed. So if you want to change something with the infrastructure master role, you have to be domain administrator. The other one that we have is RID, which actually deals with security identifiers. So every object that you have in the Active Directory, they have something called security identifier or SID. The RID actually allocates sequence of relative ID, so it's relative IDs as the abbreviation, and then what happens is that whenever a domain controller like you create users, groups, and objects, it actually assigns a unique security ID for it. And then the security ID actually consists of domain SID, which is the same for all SID created in the domain, and and then a RID, which is unique for each SID created in the domain. By default, the first server becomes the RID operation master, and then if you want to move, change the RID master role, you have to be domain admin for that.